The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the third day of this 7-day session here at Mountain Gate in September 2025. And as was said before, it's the first session of the new training period. So I'd like to start out with a poem. This is called Zazen. It's a very famous poem. It's all over the internet. I first ran into it, oddly enough, in a New Yorker magazine many, many years ago. It's by Virginia Hamilton Adair, and it is so potent and so right on in terms of the trajectory of Zen practice.
Okay, Zazen. Can everyone on there hear me okay? I'll take that as a yes. Okay, Zazen. When I first floundered in, no one knew me. Not even myself, staggering under a Saratoga trunk, crammed with humiliations bottled like urine samples, nail kegs of anger, carbons of abusive letters, chemistry quizzes with F's, even the horse I never had, and 2 casseroles left over from the dime-a-dip supper. No one remarked that I had brought too much. I was wearing 3 fur hats donated by opulent cousins, my feet encased in cement ever since the failure of the patio project, and my mouth full of barbs as an old trout. No one praised my appearance. The trunk fell off my back, disgorging its unusual contents at my stone feet, which also came off. The fur hats tumbled like a moth-eaten avalanche, burying a small monk. No one noticed. My sweat began to dry. I folded myself into one piece. No one.
So we all come into Zen practice with stuff. It's a wonderful metaphor, what this woman has written. A Saratoga trunk full of all kinds of old humiliations and so on and so forth. We have all this history, and we have bundled it up and made it appear that that's who we are. But that's not who we are. And as she illustrates, through our Zazen, gradually we begin to see these things and they release. The process of that occurs with insight. Kensho literally means insight, seeing into. And as we continue our Zazen, deeply, deeply searching, not for anything we know, because it's unknown to us, except it's real. And in another realm, it is known to us intimately. And it's as close to us as our own eyes. But we don't see it because of this pile of other stuff that we've grabbed onto as a result of our conditioning. Now, we can't blame anyone for the conditioning. We can't blame anyone for using our assumptions around that conditioning. When these things happen, we draw conclusions about ourselves, particularly if we're very young, because the parents we have, the relatives we have, the caretakers we have, the brothers and sisters who may be older than us, we can't blame them. They're important to us. We need them. And so we blame ourselves. And so the humiliations bottled like urine samples, and so on. And we come into Zazen, we start Zazen with high hopes. Often, and this is my point in this Teisho, often with an assumption that there is one thing that is going to free us, and it's a one-time event, and that is a Kensho. Sadly, we're wrong, despite close to, more than a century that Zazen has been available in the United States. Not initially very widely so, but beginning in the 50s and certainly in the 60s, it was more and more available. And nowadays, it's incredibly available. In fact, if you live in a particular town, any town, chances are there's going to be more than one different Zen group you can choose from. You can have an affiliation with a particular teacher or a leader of a Zen group. But still, the image of having to get one Kensho and then you're home free is there. Of course, in Yasutani Roshi's sesshin in Japan in the 1950s and early 60s, he would announce, of all things, when someone had a Kensho, and not only announce that they'd had a Kensho, but name the person who had the Kensho. This is an odd kind of thing to announce in a sesshin, because just like, coming in with the Saratoga trunk and the feet encased in cement and the 3 fur hats on our head, we all come in with lots of different kinds of stuff. And as we deepen our Zazen, if we're doing it appropriately, we begin to see those caught places. And so the trunk falls off our back, disgorging its contents, and that allows us to see more. The 3 fur hats fall off like a moth-eaten avalanche burying a small monk. More. And each time we see some aspect where we are caught in an illusion, in a misunderstanding, in a misperception, that is an insight. And when we have a really deep one, we could call it even more so. It's important to recognize that what is called awakening, and by that I mean full awakening, is something that doesn't come in one batch. There's a lot of work that goes into laying the groundwork so that it can take place. As you've heard many times, the Buddha, in his Zazen, began to recall past lives. This is something that people can do. It's not anything to write home about. It's not anything to cheer about. Not everybody can do it, and that's fine. It has no real value unless it is something that you see and you recognize as a place to work. And so he worked on himself for 6 full lifetimes before the lifetime in which he had the final awakening. However, even in that final awakening, a final life, he worked for another many years, doing first the prevailing spiritual practice of the day, which basically was tormenting the body, until he realized that if he kept on in that path, he was going to die. And then he would lose his possibility of the way to find his answers, his answer to why is there so much suffering? Why is there suffering? He had led, as you know, a very protected life because his father had hoped that he would inherit the title that he had. He was the head of a small kingdom, if you want to put it like that. That's how the myth goes anyway. And yet, when he was born, as customary in those times, astrologers, soothsayers, were called in to determine, to give an advance notice of what this kid had the potential to become. And as legend goes, at least some legends, there were 12 of these soothsayers, these astrologers, these psychics, who were brought in. And by the way, a soothsayer, an astrologer, and a psychic are not all the same thing. They were brought in, and half of them said he's going to become a great leader of his people like his father was. And the other half said he's going to become a great spiritual leader. And then finally, a latecomer came and broke the tie and said he's going to become a great spiritual leader. And so, in order to prevent that, his father tried to keep him closeted so that he would only experience wonderful things in his life and never see any pain. But when he got to be of a certain age, he was curious about what was outside the walls of the place he lived, which was quite extensive. And so he snuck out one night with a trusted aide. Whether he was charioteer or not, that's hard to know. I don't know that they had chariots back then in India, if that indeed was where they were. At any rate, somebody he trusted snuck out with him, and they went out 4 different nights. The first night, they saw a very old person, bent over, toothless, hair falling out, decrepit. And it shocked the Buddha because supposedly he had never seen someone like that. I don't know whether people were whisked away who were getting old in the compound where he lived or what. But at any rate, he had never really gotten that people get old and that they get old in a particularly uncomfortable and potentially unfortunate way. And it shocked him. So, curious for more, he went out the next night. And the next night, he saw someone who was sick. It reminds me of when I was in Hong Kong one visit and went around a corner, and there in the middle of the street is an older woman squatting down, throwing up. We don't see that kind of view in the United States. We may know somebody in our family who is sick, and of course the COVID epidemic really led us to see a whole bunch of people who are sick and dying. But ordinarily, we may have, a family member that gets sick. I remember when I was growing up, every year, my father would come down for about 3 weeks every summer with malaria. He apparently had had a mosquito bite in Georgia, in the swamps where they were hunting for frogs to eat frog legs. And the doctors argued about whether or not it could possibly be malaria. And one doctor believed it was, and so he gave him quinine, and he started to recover. But then the doctor over the weekend said, this is ridiculous. He couldn't possibly have malaria. And he stopped giving him quinine. And the result was that it was still in his body. And every year, all the way through high school, when I was in high school, I should say, he was down in bed with the chills and the fever for 3 weeks every summer as it rose up and hit him again. Eventually, I think it burned out. My sisters, who were much younger than I, don't really recall times when he was in that condition. But other than the fact that my mother had lots of miscarriages, and I remember one particular time when I was actually in high school. I was 14 years old at the time, and my mother was in such bad shape, having lost so much blood with the miscarriage, that my father actually carried her out to the car and drove her to the hospital, where I visited her, sneaking in because back then the rules were you couldn't be in a hospital visiting unless you were 16 years or older. Anyway, so those were the only things that happened. And of course, my brother and I got measles and chicken pox. We didn't get mumps, but it was sort of ordinary. Nobody died. Nobody, not even our grandparents at that point. It was much later that our grandparents died. My mother's father, who died as a result of a medical accident, a lack of attention actually, where he was given injections of a brand new antibiotic, double dose, because back then they didn't realize that antibiotics would not touch flu because it was a virus. And then he still wasn't well, so the next day he went back to the doctor, only it was the weekend, so his partner was there, and they apparently didn't write notes to each other. So he gave him another double dose, and 2 weeks later he was dead because it shut down his white blood cell creation, his bone marrow. But that was also an accident. It was much, much later that any of my other grandparents died. So it was sort of a normal life. And in the case of the Buddha to be, he didn't sound like he had anybody who got sick, much less anybody who died. Of course, he was young. He was only in his 20s when he got curious about things, and so maybe there wasn't anybody who got old enough to die, although the longevity in those days was around 40. You'd make it into your 40s. If you make it past the 40s, you were really, 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 really old. So he went out again a third night. This time he saw a corpse. And it really shocked him. Now, in America, we don't normally view corpses in their natural state. There's more and more over the last several decades of work with people in hospice. So people are much more attuned to people dying. It's not the fearsome thing. Well, maybe it is still the fearsome thing because plenty of people are afraid of dying. That it was back in the 50s when our old minister died, and we all trooped up to see him in the coffin, and he was very clearly very dead. But they had, as the old saying used to go, gussied him up and painted it so that he looked like he was asleep. And often in those days in particular, and particularly now as well, parents will tell their young children who want to know where grandpa or grandma went, that they just went to sleep. And now they're going to heaven, and they're going to sleep in heaven. And children were not ordinarily taken to funerals, so they didn't even have a chance to see the corpse. When my uncle died of pancreatic cancer, his wife, my aunt, wouldn't let her kids see him as he was dying. She wanted them to remember him as he was, alive and fresh and new and himself, which unfortunately robbed them of a very valuable experience. And this is how it went. I don't know if they got to go to the funeral or not, but again, they do their best to paint people up, dress them up in clothes, and make like they're just asleep. There's a wonderful Japanese movie that's worth watching. It is, I think it's dubbed in English. It's called Transitions, and it's about a cello player who was playing in an orchestra, and the orchestra was just going down. They had this incredible performance, and with just a few people in the audience, and finally the owner of the orchestra got up after the performance and, crying, announced that he was shutting the orchestras down. And so all of a sudden, this young man who just bought a really expensive cello was out of work. And so what's he going to do? And he answers an ad in the newspaper advertising work doing transitions. And they thought it was, people traveling. Well, it actually was, but not the way we normally think of people traveling. And in it, he learned how to paint and powder and dress people who had died so that they would look good in their coffins. We live with an awful lot of denial in our lives, including denial of our own incredible beingness, our innate perfection, our innate worthiness. And it is when these attachments to a misperception enter the zendo and zazen gets to work, they begin to dissolve. They begin to come and appear as they really are. Illusions, misperceptions. And those are those hats falling off, the feet encased in cement, the cement falling off, and so on and so forth. And as I said before, each time we see the truth in one of these things, it is an insight, it is a kensho. And we continue on working, continuing to work, continuing to have insights, even deeper ones. And of course, the long maturation comes into that as well, because we can have a recognition that we are, for example, acting in a particular way. But unless we work to change that way we're acting, which is based on a misperception, it's not going to go away. We can hide it behind us and go on acting the same way we were acting before. inviting in the same amount of pain and misunderstanding that we did before. So when we have these insights, it's important to really, really take a look. And if they're deep enough, they will be deep enough to make us realize that they're false. And along with realizing that they're false, there will be a sense that it would be kind of ridiculous to keep dragging them in. I mean, it's like, why wear your baby clothes when you're an adult? Oh, it's clear that they're false, and it's much easier to let them go. That's a deeper level of insight. And we continue on, and we continue on. And as we gradually drop not only the trunk, but all its contents, seeing through them as just misperceptions, misunderstandings, false attachments, useless, not worth dragging along with us anymore. We become little by little more free. And that allows us to have deeper insights. Maybe a satori. And that still isn't home free yet. Hakuin, the great Zen master Hakuin, who completely revolutionized Rinzai Zen, which was pretty morbid when he was doing Zen practice, and made it what it is today. His lineage is the only one that continues on down. All the other Rinzai lineages have faded out because he was so dynamic, he was so powerful, he was so insistent on deepening, not being satisfied with a little bit of kensho or even a satori. And he said that he had 19 major kenshos. We could call those satoris. And countless minor insights. And he didn't have his final one, which truly freed him, until he was 53. But he'd had his first one when he was in his late teens, early 20s. He just kept working. And that's what we need to do. Just keep working. Because as we keep working, we see more deeply where we are caught. And as we see increasingly deeply where we're caught, and let those things go, both through tuning in and recognizing that they're kind of useless. There's no point. It's like, playing with paper dolls when you have a real child. And so we continue, and we continue, and we continue, and we gradually get more and more free. And it begins to get exciting every time you see where you're caught and see it deeply enough that, why drag this along? And then you have reached another level. But the freedom that comes, the joy that comes, is so worth walking in with that Saratoga trunk full of crap. It is so worth facing the blankness that comes when there's a part of us that is trying to push back against any kind of insight. And so it kind of turns us into a dissociated person, or at least makes it feel like we've got this enormous immovable wall that is impossible to get through. Or there are traditional sayings, trying to climb a glass mountain, or trying to climb a silver mountain, or I like this one in particular. Like a mosquito trying to bite an iron ball. And then there's the point where we begin to, but don't quite get through that wall. And that is likened to having eaten a hot mochi, and you can't spit it out and you can't swallow it because half of it is down your throat and the other half is just burning your mouth. And that happens when we have mochi in okayu. And the mochi in okayu, that's a breakfast thing in Japan and Rinzai monasteries at a certain time of the year. It's in the fall when we make the mochi. Basically, I think it's the winter solstice that we make the mochi in. So we make these wonderful little soft sweet bean paste filled mochis. And we also make some that are not filled with anything. And they harden and they become temporary altar in our room with a sprig of bamboo on top and a mikan, mandarin orange, which is ripened back in that time of year as well, just like our oranges and our grapefruits and tangerines and so on ripen right around that time of year as well. And then after New Year's, and all the New Year's ceremonies are taken care of, we collect all the little mini altars, at least the mochi part, and eat the mikan, which is especially good. And it gets cut up into small pieces and put in the okayu, which is the rice gruel, as it's called, that's eaten at breakfast during sesshin. And when you get one of those mochis in your mouth, it has melted, by the way. It is still something of a lump, but it is viscous. And some of it starts to go down your throat, but it's too hot to swallow. So you're stuck with this hot thing in your mouth and almost choking on what has gone down your throat. And so that's how it can seem when you are starting to make headway through this barrier and yet not all the way through. Using the felt sense is the way to melt it. And we've talked a lot about the felt sense in many, many teishos. It is tuning into the physical sensations in your body so fully that any self-identity temporarily disappears. And that can give you insights into what this block is all about, what it's hiding. And even if it doesn't give you an insight, it will begin to melt the block. And you'll end up going through possibly several different layers of what this block is, metaphorically, through the felt sense work. That is when you have completely become present with one of the felt senses, then it'll give an obvious shift, and it's obvious sort of, and it dissolves. This is different from it just simply disappearing. If it's simply disappearing, you haven't done a thorough enough job of that, and that can take some time, repeated exposure to that felt sense. But when it does, then it often will reveal a different sense that was there beneath it, and sometimes there's a different sense beneath that. But it is just incredible how this felt sense worth can free us from being caught. And even if there's a blankness, we can tune into the blankness. That's actually a felt sense too, to feel what blankness feels like. And then it'll shift and reveal something else beneath it. And in this way, we progress, getting deeper and deeper insights. And then, as we become more free, maybe a satori, which is a deeper one yet. And we continue and continue and continue. And it is a joyful work. It can feel really awful in the beginning because we're dealing with the full baggage. But as those bottles of resentments dissolve, as those barbs dissolve out of our mouth, as those moth-eaten fur hats dissolve, we become, as we keep saying, more and more free. And the whole point in doing Zazen is to become totally free through experiencing the truth of reality. And the truth of reality is phenomenal and yet so ordinary. So ordinary. Of course it's like this. But when we really see deeply enough into it, and we will not necessarily see deeply enough into it, even with a deeper satori, as Hakuin's example is, we keep on going and gradually become increasingly let go and therefore increasingly free to be who we really are, responsive to circumstances rather than reactive. And eventually we may reach, hopefully, the point where Mitra-roshi reached in his training, where he suddenly realized he had nothing to defend. All he had to do was to respond, to receive. And maybe response wasn't even called for. But receiving with open hands and no idea of anybody who is going to be receiving, that is true freedom. And that is what is built into every one of you. Each one of you can realize. And it's a process. You don't just do Zazen for X number of weeks, days, months, years, and then boom, a big enlightenment experience. No. You might have a big enlightenment experience, but then you need to continue in order to really bring it to life in your life. As the famous book title goes, after the ecstasy, the laundry. There's work to be done, including deepening, expanding your awareness of the truth. It's so exciting. It's so exciting. Thank you for listening, and we'll stop here and recite the 4 vows.